What about demonic forces? Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Simmons. I'm the priest in the hot seat. And I got a question recently wondering about what this guy called the spirit of Leviathan. He was also wondering about the spirit of Jezebel and a python spirit. He asked, what do these spirits look like in today's world? And how do we deal with such spirits? So I'm going to try to tackle these very interesting questions, which I didn't really have a lot of quick answer to, other than to say, Paul famously said that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly realms. Now, Paul didn't have a whole lot to say about them, and there's been a lot of attempts over the years to flesh out what these demonic forces are like. You might remember C.S. Lewis's famous Screwtape Letters, a series of conversations, correspondence between Screwtape and the manager and his employee Wormwood, both in the demonic bureaucracy, managing the temptation and downfall of a new Christian. And then in the 1980s, Frank Peretti wrote the novel This Present Darkness, which was famous for its depiction of spiritual warfare in the small town, showing angels and demons battling behind the scenes for everyday human events. Peretti portrayed individual demons at work behind the scenes, behind different vices that people have in their lives, a spirit of unforgiveness for the bitter person, a spirit of alcohol for the addict, of gossip or lust or whatever the vice or temptation is. There's a demon, individual demon there tempting you to indulge. But in contemporary Pentecostalism, there's been a heightened awareness of different spirits at work in our world and in our lives, like the Leviathan spirit, a python spirit, a Jezebel spirit. I'd like to just focus on one today as an example, the spirit of Leviathan. Now, when my friend gave me this question, I was familiar with the Leviathan, of course, from the Bible, but not a spirit of Leviathan. So I looked it up in this big fat book I have called the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. It's a massive work of immense scholarship. It's a great resource for all things ancient and spiritual, all things ancient and evil. And I looked up each of these figures in the Bible to see what we know about them from the ancient sources, both pagan and biblical, there in the dictionary. Then I went to YouTube to see what contemporary preachers and teachers are saying about these spirits. And I came across a number who have a lot to say about each of them and this infernal trio. So what I'd like to do is dig into what we know about Leviathan and the spirit of Leviathan from the dictionary, and then I'll relate it to some biblical events, and then we can talk about the relevance of this imagery in our engagement with the spiritual realm day to day. All right, so we have the spirit of Leviathan. The Bible has a little bit to say about Leviathan, but in ancient mythology outside the Bible, Leviathan shows up a lot. He was an ancient sea dragon. He was associated with chaos and darkness like the sea. So he was a personification of the mysterious, chaotic depths of the Mediterranean Sea. His name also is Litanu and Rahab. He's one of the most ancient figures in ancient mythological literature in Ugarit, in Babylon, and in the writings of the Jews. He was like a primordial sea serpent that surrounded the land. Of course, the ancient view was that the earth was flat and the seas surrounded the land. He represented chaos and evil. And whenever a god wanted to make a bid for dominance over the pantheon of the other gods, he had to go up against Leviathan. Baal is famous in Canaan for fighting to gain mastery over Leviathan. Marduk did the same in Babylon. To dominate the other gods in the pantheon, they had to first defeat Leviathan. Now, in the Bible, we see Yahweh slaying Leviathan in the act of creation. That's behind the scenes, that's between the lines of the Genesis account, bringing order out of the primordial chaos associated with a great dragon. In Psalm 74, the psalmist refers to Yahweh defeating the chaos dragon in the Exodus. So when he's bringing his people out of Egypt, delivering Israel through the waters of the Red Sea, the psalmist tells that story as a defeat of Leviathan. And in Psalm 74, he's doing it in the context of a complaint about invaders coming into the land of Israel, probably the Assyrians, like in the 7th century BC. They were threatening to destroy the temple in Jerusalem. And so the psalmist looks back to the Exodus, remembers God's victory over Leviathan, and he calls on God to repeat that victory in this day faced with the Assyrian assault. He's saying in verse 12 of Psalm 74, God is king from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might, referring to the Exodus. You broke the heads of the dragon in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. A couple centuries later, Isaiah picks up on this past victory of God over Leviathan to foretell a future victory over Leviathan that he's seeing on a distant horizon. Check out Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1. He says, "On that day, the Lord, with his cruel and great strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea." Now, in this context, Leviathan seems to be a proxy, a stand-in, working as a metaphor for a political entity in the world at the time, probably Babylon. And Isaiah is anticipating Israel's rescue from the Babylonian captivity, which is beyond the lifespan of Isaiah, but he sees that day coming when God will smite again Leviathan. It will become a fleeing serpent, and God will bring his people back to the promised land. And Isaiah goes on to promise the end of the Babylonian exile, the return of God's people to the land. Folks, if you like the Priest in the Hot Seat podcast, I ask you to do two things. One, send it to a friend, because that's how these things go viral. And two is, if you have a question that you'd like me to try to answer, then put it in the comment section below. Thanks, and I'm really glad to have you here. Now, Matthew's gospel picks up very consciously on that promise of Israel's return. Matthew points to Jesus as the one who's going to make that happen. He's going to gather the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He's going to end the exile. He's going to inaugurate his long-promised kingdom coming. And when he shows us Jesus, he's very conspicuously putting him in that role. Jesus starts out focused only on the house of Israel. But then in Matthew chapter 14, John the Baptist is killed and Jesus flees. He departs north to the Gentile lands up on the far side of the Sea of Galilee. He portrays Jesus's disciples as crossing the waters to get there, okay, crossing the Sea of Galilee in their fishing boat. And it's not just an itinerary, it's rich with symbolic meaning. Jesus sends them ahead, and Jesus catches up with them that night. He goes out walking on the water. So what's he doing walking on the water? Obviously, it's a miracle, right? Of course, sure. It's a miracle. It's a huge miracle. But from another perspective, like big deal, big whoop. It's another miracle. I think Matthew is showing us a very meaningful miracle, not just another miracle. He's demonstrating again how Jesus defeats Leviathan. Now, Brian Godawa is an author, a novelist, and he's written a series of novels that tell the story of the Bible, including all the spiritual principalities and powers that are involved in the story behind the scenes. So the fallen gods, the false gods of the pantheon in ancient pagan mythology, as well as the angels, Michael, Gabriel, Remuel, the seven archangels. They're all characters involved in the stories that we're familiar with from the Bible. And his novel, Jesus Triumphant, tells this story in such a way that Leviathan, slain in the Sea of Galilee, is floating just below the surface of the water. And Jesus is walking upon the slain dragon from head to head upon the water as he approaches the boat with the disciples in it in the churning of the sea. And then, of course, we get to the book of Revelation. We see several instances where dragons, demonic powers, Leviathan show up at critical moments in the story and at every juncture in the cyclical retelling of the climactic battle of the Old Covenant there, how Leviathan is defeated. So that's Leviathan in the Bible. But of course, people now talk about a spirit of Leviathan that is at work in the world. What's with that? It's seen as a controlling spirit, dictatorial in power in this world. It twists words to deceive and to control the people of the earth. The Leviathan spirit is seen as divisive, stirring up conflict and pride and misunderstanding, which is often used by people in power, right, to divide and conquer populations of the nations. And you can clearly see these tendencies rampant in our world and in our communities. But having dipped into some of this teaching, I don't know, it seems to me like they have maybe built a large interpretive structure, the spirit of Leviathan, upon a very slender exegetical foundation. You know, the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible observes the Mesopotamian, the Ugaritic, the Egyptian literature on the great sea dragon is far more detailed in their descriptions of this beast than the biblical texts are, which is interesting. The way they put it is the biblical texts develop little knowledge of the appearance or the actions of Leviathan. The Bible doesn't have a lot to say describing this beast. And so what can we draw from that lesson? I think we can suppose that the biblical authors had good reason for being very sparing in their description of Leviathan. But now it seems like Pentecostal preachers and others seem strongly tempted to fill in what the biblical authors left vague. So I suppose that you can use the Leviathan as a great metaphor to describe this kind of behavior in human societies and human hearts. And certainly Thomas Hobbes did in his 1600s book, The Leviathan, right? He used that image, that metaphor, to describe the overarching power of what was taking shape then of bureaucratic nation states. But I want to be careful that we're not like Flip Wilson and saying, a Leviathan spirit made me do it. I think it's too easy to assign blame to something like a Leviathan spirit, which we're not really sure exactly what it is from the biblical or ancient Near Eastern material. So yes, indeed, we wrestle with principalities and powers, as Paul says. But why does Paul never identify a spirit of Leviathan when he's talking about those principalities and powers? Notice that he's purposefully vague in describing those principalities and powers. So I don't think we are intended to be on a kind of a first name basis with these demonic powers, calling them Leviathan spirit or a Jezebel spirit or whatever, other than as a way of metaphorically describing them. And if we do seek a deeper dive, let me recommend to you Brian Godawa. I mentioned him earlier in his description of Jesus walking on the water. I think he does a great job researching ancient biblical worldview and the ancient mythologies that are in the context of that biblical worldview. He was very thorough in basing his narrative in that series, the Chronicles of the Nephilim, on those ancient mythologies. I think he stays pretty close to the script in imagining how they have governed human imagination back then and ever since. He has a series of novels that he's written telling the story behind the story of the patriarchs there in Genesis 1 through 11, and from Abraham up through Jesus, through the whole Old Testament, of the spiritual warfare that was going on in the life of Israel and the birth of the church. And I highly recommend it to you, how those biblical characters were confronting and warring against the gods and goddesses of the ancient Near East in Egypt and Babylon. And he takes us all the way up through the life of Jesus, I think in ways that are very imaginative, fairly plausible, and I'd say have a high degree of fidelity to the biblical revelation that we have. And he, I think, very convincingly shows how the Bible was written to correct the ancient mythologies in the context and conversation with those ancient mythologies, to give the true story from the perspective of Yahweh, who is the most high God over all those ancient would-be gods. And I think the result is very detailed, realistic, practical, comprehensive, and deep perspective on spiritual warfare that is biblical and applicable to today's world. So check him out. Brian Godawa, Chronicles of the Nephilim. Now, if you like this episode, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell so that you know the next time we drop a Priest in the Hot Seat episode. And help us make this thing go viral by sending it to your friends. Thanks, and God bless you.